In early 2003, the argument was presented as urgent. Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical stockpiles, biological agents, active programs hidden from inspectors. The assessment was delivered with confidence. Intelligence briefings, satellite imagery, intercepted communications, human sources, all assembled into a case that suggested delay was dangerous. The conclusion was clear. Waiting carried risk. On March 20th, 2003, the invasion began. Cruise missiles struck Baghdad. Aircraft crossed Iraqi airspace. Ground forces moved north from Kuwait in one of the fastest armored advances in modern warfare. The operation was built on a central premise that Saddam Hussein's regime retained prohibited weapons and possibly the capacity to reconstitute nuclear ambitions. It was also built on assumptions about what would happen after the regime fell, that Iraqi institutions would hold, that resistance would be limited, that reconstruction would be manageable. The plan anticipated rapid military success. It did not anticipate prolonged instability. In the weeks before the invasion, intelligence assessments were treated as solid ground. Policymakers and commanders acted within that framework. But intelligence is not certainty. It is probability. And when probability is treated as fact, the consequences can shape the course of history. Because once the bombs fall, assumptions are no longer theoretical. They become reality on the ground. Because once the bombs fall, assumptions are no longer theoretical. They become reality on the ground. Before the first missile launched, the framework was already set. In October 2002, the U.S. intelligence community released a national intelligence estimate assessing that Iraq possessed chemical and biological weapons and was reconstituting its nuclear program. The language included caveats and dissenting views, particularly from parts of the State Department and the Department of Energy, but the dominant judgment supported the presence of active WMD programs. That assessment shaped everything that followed. Military planners prepared for the possibility that Iraqi forces would deploy chemical weapons on the battlefield. Units trained and equipped for contaminated environments. Protective gear was issued. Operational timelines were designed around neutralizing suspected WMD sites quickly. The expectation was that these weapons existed. The expectation was that once discovered, they would validate the decision to invade. There were additional assumptions layered on top. Intelligence assessments suggested that Iraqi command structures were fragile. Years of sanctions and internal repression were believed to have weakened the regime's cohesion. Some analysts projected that Iraqi military units might surrender quickly. Others anticipated that local populations would cooperate with coalition forces once Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. Planning reflected that confidence. The invasion force was comparatively lean for an operation intended to occupy a country of over 25 million people. The assumption was that large-scale post-war stabilization would not require massive troop numbers. The campaign emphasized speed, a rapid decapitation of the regime, followed by transition. Inside the intelligence community, there were unresolved doubts, questions about sources, uncertainty about mobile biological laboratories, disagreement over aluminum tubes allegedly intended for nuclear centrifuges. But in the months leading to war, the dominant narrative solidified. Intelligence was presented as a strong foundation rather than a set of competing probabilities. And once that foundation was accepted, the operational design followed logically. Neutralize the regime, secure the weapons, stabilize the country, move forward. On paper, it was coherent. In reality, it depended on something that had not yet been tested, whether the core premise was true. The invasion unfolded with speed few expected. Within weeks, coalition forces had crossed hundreds of miles of desert. Baghdad fell on April 9, 2003. The statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down in Firdos Square, a moment broadcast worldwide as a symbol of regime collapse. Militarily, the opening phase was decisive. The Iraqi army disintegrated faster than many planners had anticipated. Organized resistance from conventional units faded. Key government buildings were seized. Command centers were abandoned. But as Iraqi territory came under coalition control, a question moved from background concern to urgent priority. Where were the weapons? Teams were deployed to suspected storage facilities. Sites identified in intelligence assessments were searched. Scientists were questioned. Documents were seized. Stockpiles were not found. No active chemical weapons caches. No biological agent production facilities ready for deployment. No reconstituted nuclear weapons program on the verge of completion. Initial explanations suggested concealment, that materials had been moved, hidden, destroyed in the final days before the invasion. But as weeks passed, the absence became harder to reconcile with pre-war certainty. At the same time, a second reality was emerging. The Iraqi state apparatus had collapsed more completely than anticipated. Ministries were looted. Police disappeared from the streets. Arms depots were unsecured. Infrastructure deteriorated. The assumption that Iraqi institutions would remain functional proved incorrect. In May 2003, the Coalition Provisional Authority made two decisions that would reshape the environment immediately: the formal dissolution of the Iraqi army and a sweeping de-Baathification order, removing members of Saddam's ruling party from government roles. These decisions were made in a context defined by earlier intelligence assessments. The regime had been viewed as irredeemably hostile and structurally tied to WMD ambitions. Removing its core elements was seen as necessary, but the immediate result was a vacuum. Hundreds of thousands of armed men were suddenly unemployed. Administrative expertise vanished. Security gaps widened. The initial invasion had succeeded in toppling a regime. It had not secured the peace. And the central justification, the existence of active weapons of mass destruction, was increasingly in doubt. The critical moment was not only the fall of Baghdad, it was the realization that the war's foundational premise did not match the evidence on the ground. By the summer of 2003, the gap between expectation and reality was undeniable. No stockpiles, no active chemical weapons program, no deployed biological agents. Subsequent investigations, including the Iraq Survey Group, would conclude that Iraq had ended its WMD programs years earlier, though it retained intent and fragmented capabilities. The central premise that shaped the invasion was fundamentally flawed. But by then, the strategic environment had already shifted. The rapid collapse of Iraqi security forces, combined with the disbanding of the army and broad de-Baathification, created a power vacuum. Weapons depots were looted. Borders were porous. Former regime elements, foreign fighters, and emerging militias began organizing. What had been planned as a short stabilization phase evolved into a growing insurgency. Improvised explosive devices appeared along supply routes. Ambushes increased. sectarian tensions intensified. The conflict changed character from conventional invasion to asymmetric warfare. Military doctrine had prepared for defeating an army. It had not fully prepared for rebuilding a state under fire. The intelligence failure had consequences beyond the battlefield. International credibility was affected. Alliances were strained. Regional dynamics shifted. Iran's influence inside Iraq expanded in the absence of a strong centralized authority. Inside the United States, intelligence processes came under scrutiny. Reviews examined how analytic judgments were formed, how dissenting views were handled, and how uncertainty was communicated to policymakers. The lesson was not that intelligence is useless. It was that intelligence must remain conditional. When assessments harden into certainty, strategic flexibility narrows. And when war plans are built on that certainty, errors compound quickly. The invasion removed a regime. It did not produce the stability many expected. The consequences would unfold for years, measured not just in deployments and budgets, but in lives altered across Iraq and beyond. The Iraq War did not begin with a battlefield defeat. It began with a conclusion, an intelligence conclusion treated as settled. The failure was not a single document or a single source. It was systemic. Fragmented reporting reinforced existing assumptions. Caveats were overshadowed by summary judgments. Policymakers operated within a framework that treated uncertainty as manageable rather than fundamental. When the invasion removed Saddam Hussein quickly, it appeared to validate the operational design. But the absence of weapons reshaped the war's meaning. Strategically, the consequences were long-term. The U.S. military adapted to counterinsurgency under pressure. Force structure and doctrine evolved. Intelligence processes were reformed. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened. Analytic tradecraft was reassessed across agencies. Globally, the episode altered perceptions of American intelligence credibility. Future warnings, whether about Iran, Syria, or other emerging threats, would be received with greater skepticism. Inside Iraq, the power vacuum accelerated internal fractures. Sectarian violence intensified in subsequent years. The conflict became a breeding ground for extremist groups, including the precursor to ISIS. None of this was part of the initial invasion plan. The plan was built on speed, on regime removal, on the assumption that once the premise was proven, stabilization would follow. But the premise was not proven, and war does not pause while evidence is reconsidered. The lesson is not partisan. It is structural. Intelligence is an assessment, not a guarantee. Military success cannot compensate for flawed assumptions at the strategic level. And once force is used, the consequences extend far beyond the first objective. The Iraq War demonstrates a hard truth. When decisions are made on confidence rather than certainty, the battlefield becomes the place where those judgments are tested. And history rarely offers revisions in real time. War does not adjust itself to expectations. It reveals them.